Haastattelu on tuotettu kaupallisessa yhteistyössä That Game Companyn kanssa. That Game Companyn Sky Children of the Light-pelin uusi kausi lähestyy. Teemana uudella kaudella on suomalaisten rakastamat muumit ja erityisesti muumit ja näkymätön lapsi tarina, johon Skyn pelaajat pääsee uppoutumaan aivan uusilla tavoilla. Päästiin haastattelemaan pelin narrative designer Charley Popea tämän uuden kauden tiimoilta, ja haastattelustahan tuli oikein rattoisa ja hauska kuunneltava. Tosi informatiivista juttua ja sen lisäksi myös vähän kevyempää keskustelua siihen kylkeen. Nauttikaa haastattelusta ja pelatkaa Sky Children of the Light-pelin uutta kautta Season of the Muumien, kun se julkaistaan 14. lokakuuta. Can you tell us how the collaboration between Sky and Muumien came about? What inspired the partnership?
Sure. So I wasn't privy to the initial introduction or the higher up conversations that got the ball rolling, but what I can tell you is that I was reached out to early last year by Genova and told that we had this opportunity to pitch this collaboration with Muumien. At the time, I had never read Muumien, but I quickly fell in love as I started to work my way through the books. And once I had kind of a grasp on the world, we started this, what ended up being an incredibly lengthy pitch process. I think we went through like 5 or 6 rounds of pitching with the Muumien team, pitching different ways that we could kind of lift Muumien Valley off the page and into an interactive medium. The Muumien team, I think, is very understandably protective of Tove Jansson's work.
Oh, yeah.
After reading the books, I really understand why. I think there's something really special and something that's very different from the kinds of stories that we're inundated with nowadays, and especially in this world where I think IPs are sometimes treated with much less respect than they deserve. I really appreciate how careful the Muumien team was in deciding whether or not to work with us, and I'm very grateful that they did. So that's kind of the first half of it, which is this, we went through this sort of long process of coming up with ideas, proposing it to the Muumien team, getting feedback, going back to the drawing board, doing it again. But as for the second part of the question, on our side, I think the collaboration with Muumien was a really easy decision to make. Muumien Valley is this world that balances darkness with light, like seriousness with silliness, in a way that really rhymes with what we strive to do with Sky. And so it was an attractive partnership right from the get-go, and finding that place of intersection between the two worlds really wasn't too difficult.
Muumien holds a really special part in all hearts of Finnish people, because we grow up watching the TV shows and reading the books, watching the movies. So it's always so interesting to see it like in a gaming form, honestly. Which also brings me to the next question. How is the Muumien story, as I understand it being the invisible child, be adapted to fit the world and theme of Sky?
So the most important thing here, because we knew right from the get-go, Genova became very attached to the Ninny story. Understandably, It's a really beautiful story, and so
it is.
The primary goal was to tell the story as faithfully as possible. And so to do that, we focused on the original version of the story as told in Tales from Muumien Valley. We didn't use the comics or the animated show as our point of inspiration. We really wanted to focus on the source material. And how we're telling it, we split it up into essentially kind of 6 chapters, right? Like Ninny is this, the story of the invisible child for Ninny, she arrives at the Muumien house completely invisible, and then slowly regains her invisibility regains her visibility rather throughout the story. And we found these sort of clear moments of shift where she gains a little bit of visibility here, a little bit of visibility here. And so that was where we kind of drew these lines for these chapters. And so each of these chapters becomes a quest that players can experience once they begin the season. And then how they will do that, they will experience these quests as a butterfly within Muumien Valley. That was another thing that we were really trying to protect, was the sort of sanctity of Moomin Valley. And so they don't enter the Moomin Valley as their characters from Sky. They enter the Moomin Valley as a creature of Moomin Valley itself and kind of move through the Moomin Valley as this kind of impartial third-person observer. They don't really participate in the story beyond sort of progressing it further. And the quests themselves are structured very similarly to the traditional spirit quests that players may be used to in Sky. For those who don't know what those are, they're kind of like a living comic book. You move from frozen moment to frozen moment, watching as Nini is brought to the Moomin house, welcomed by the Moomin family. The biggest change that players might be, from what players might be used to, is that we have dialogue in these scenes. Dialogue that is, for the most part, with a few very small exceptions, pulled directly from the books. We really wanted players to feel as if they were living the stories as Tove Jansson originally wrote them.
Wow. Is it voice acted dialogue or just text?
No voice acting. Although we do have, and I talk about this later, but we do have in Sky what are called shouts, which are just sort of like these sounds that characters make to indicate that they're speaking. And so we do have like unique shouts for each of the Moomin characters. And so while we don't hear them speak, we do get to hear what their voices sound like to some degree.
That's awesome. Are there any specific mechanics or gameplay elements related to Nini's invisibility? If so, how do they play along with the social aspect of the game?
So this was really tricky to figure out, right? Like, invisibility by its nature is when a character is not visually represented, and when working in a visual medium, that can be very difficult to communicate.
Yeah.
And so what helped with this was the understanding that Nini's invisibility is a metaphor for her having withdrawn into herself as a result of this treatment that she went through before being brought to the Moomins. Tove Jansson really beautifully communicates in the story Nini coming out of her shell by becoming more and more visible as the story progresses. And we wanted to draw attention to that, and we did that in a couple of ways. Many of the ways are kind of traditional visual storytelling tools, right? Like, the changes in where the camera is, drawing attention to like in the scene with the apples, for example, drawing attention to her legs and feet as she gains a little bit more invisibility at the end of that scene. But something else that we experimented with was, typically when Nini becomes more visible, it's a victory, right? It's a moment of her losing a little bit of her fear. And so to focus on that, we decided to play with color saturation. I really loved this idea of portraying Moomin Valley as black and white to really make it feel like we're in a storybook. And the moments where this change are when Nini becomes more visible, right? We have in those moments, we have this sort of spreading saturation of color, starting with her and then spreading out into the scene around her. And in that way, we hope to kind of draw attention to the emotional nature of the invisibility, that it's not just a physical phenomenon. As far as how it relates to the social aspect of the game, the way that we did that is we gave players, or we're going to give players, an outfit that makes them invisible. We really wanted to bring this notion, this sort of theme from Nini's story into the world of Sky and let players experience it for themselves.
Cool. Now the next question is a bit more lighthearted, I must admit, but there's a few of those here tonight. If the Moomins formed a band, who would play which instrument and what genre of music would they perform?
So I loved this question, and I actually did a whole bunch of research. Like, I went back and reread a bunch of books over the weekend because I wanted to come up with the absolutely best answer that I could.
That is commitment.
So obviously Snufkin would play the harmonica. Or the mouth organ, as it's described. And I think it's also pretty obvious, at least for me, that Little Mai would play the drums.
She has the right energy.
Exactly. I don't think Moomin Troll would actually play any instrument. I think he would whistle, right? Like, it's often described in the books how good he is at whistling, and so I can kind of imagine that being his contribution. The rest of these are A little bit reaches, but that kind of makes sense to me for the characters. Moomin Mama, I see her playing a piano, right? Like something homey, something that she could like keep in the house, maybe something that's like passed down through generations. I don't know why, but I feel like Moomin Papa would play something kind of needlessly complicated, like an accordion or something like that. And just by virtue of it being kind of shiny and a little startling, I think Sniff would play something like a trumpet. Um, Although she's not in this season, I had to include Snork Maiden because I can't get this image out of my head of her playing a clarinet, right? Like I think that just makes sense to me. And I don't
Yeah.
think Two Tiki would play anything. I think she would be the sound engineer. Um, and so that gives you, right, a harmonica, the drums, a piano, an accordion, a trumpet, and a clarinet with Moomintroll whistling. And so, as for the genre, I'm not certain what genre they would play, but one of my favorite scenes from the books is the scene from the end of Finn Family Moomintroll where they throw that party, that like August party, and it's in that scene. It's described that they pull out a radio and tune it to American dance music, and I, and in the stories when music is played, it's often in like sort of like this moment of peace, like this moment. It's like Snufkin is playing music for people on an adventure as a way of like kind of like winding down the day, or it's a moment of excitement, a moment of people wanting to dance. And so I think that whatever music they play, it would be something that you could dance to, something like folk or like funk or something like that. But I do feel like it would be a bit chaotic.
Oh, absolutely. And I think folk is probably something that they would do. It just strikes me as the type of genre to fit those.
I agree.
Aside from the Invisible Child, which is obviously an iconic Moomin story, do you have any other favorite stories?
Yes. So my favorite book is Moominland Midwinter for a lot of reasons. I grew up in Alaska, and it really reminded me. I think that Tove Jansson really nailed what it feels like during the depth of winter in a very cold place. Um, but
Been
this,
there.
yes, I can imagine. I can imagine. And like just really lovely that story. And sort of Moomin Troll's kind of, I mean, I won't even call it a slow acceptance, just kind of like his journey in being alone in this landscape and trying to take care of the house and the interactions that he has with Little Mai and the squirrel and Lady of Winter and whatnot. But the story that I actually felt like I had to talk about is a short story from Tales from Moomin Valley, which I don't ever hear people discuss, called The Filly Jonk Who Loved Disasters. And
Hmm.
this story really touched me when I first read it. It just as like a brief recap, it's a story about this filly junk who lives by herself on the beach, and she's convinced she like lives by herself in this house that's like full of all of these things, and she's convinced that a disaster is like imminently going to descend on her and destroy her life. And she's terrified. She's just paralyzed with fear, and it's clear that she's kind of living in a little bit of a delusion. Like her friend doesn't really know how to talk to her or how to show up for her. Um, and she's like going a little bit crazy in this space by herself until an actual tornado descends and destroys her house. And as in like there's this scene as she's watching all of her furniture like fly up into the sky, that she like takes this deep breath and she says, now I'll never be afraid again. Now I'm free. Now I can do anything. And I read this story early in 2023 on the heels of everything that happened between 2020 and that moment, right? Like of lockdown
Hmm.
and COVID and spending so much time being stuck in a house and like watching the news and waiting for the next disaster to happen, that I just deeply, deeply related to it. And it really the part of it that I really loved the most was this sort of feeling of freedom on the other side of that, of like experiencing the thing that you're terrified of, and then having everything be okay at the end. And it really, I don't know, it just touched me. So yeah, I would pick that one.
It's quite surprising to me how deep their stories were when you think that they are actually like meant for families to read and for children to read. It really can sometimes shock you to the core how deep the stories are. Her philosophy and worldview is just something else.
I couldn't agree more. And I'm also really, I mean, this isn't, you know, related to any of the questions you've asked so far, but like it makes sense to me why they're so popular now, so
Yeah,
long after she wrote them, because the first story is written during the Winter War in 1939, and it was written during this time when I can imagine there was a lot of fear and a lot of hopelessness and a lot of uncertainty about the future. And this sort of fairy tale land that she invented really like was both a beautiful escape. I mean, I'm imagining both a beautiful escape from that kind of life, but also an incredible commentary on it. And I think that we live during a time when now there's a lot of fear and a lot of hopelessness and a lot of uncertainty about the future. And so it makes sense that the stories written during that period would be speaking to people now.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Which Moomin character do you most relate to?
So I have to be honest on this one. As much as I hate to admit it, I think I relate most to Moomin Papa. He like I'd love to say like Snufkin or even Little
Yeah,
Mime.
that main character energy of Snufkin,
Exactly.
you know? Yeah.
But I mean, Moomin Papa, he spends all of his time, or a lot of his time, holed up in his room writing. Occasionally he gets really restless and kind of leaves on these long voyages but he always returns home, and it's a home that he built with his own two hands, which is something that I've always dreamed of doing. And so, uh, despite how kind of the role that he plays in the Moomin family, I think he is the person that I relate to the most.
He is a very interesting character, and I think the stories don't highlight him and his inner workings enough. Because I'd love to know more about Moomin Papa, honestly. He's a very interesting character.
Yeah, I agree.
What visual and auditory changes are coming to the game with the Moomin theme? Will there be recognizable music or characters included? And I think characters is an obvious answer there, but
Well, as for visual changes, we really tried to represent Moomin Valley as faithfully as we could. This was,
yeah,
I mean, it's difficult because Moomin Valley is a very dreamlike space, and like distance is never really like accurately measured, and so we worked very hard to make sure that all of the scenes as they happen take place in a part of the Moomin Valley that like feels like what that scene felt like in the books. Um, and we include a lot of iconic locations in Moomin Valley. Obviously not all of them, but we did our best to represent Moomin Valley uh, as to make it feel like a storybook land. The biggest visual change I think would be the lack of color, which I've already discussed a little bit. Everything being in black and white.
yeah,
Um, as for audio changes, there won't be any recognizable music. All the music that we have, we've written ourselves. But as I mentioned earlier, we did have these sort of unique shouts that we
yeah.
made for each character, and so we went through our own process of imagining what each of these characters sounds like. And yes, there will be other characters, namely, besides the characters that are in the Ninny story, which are Moomin Troll, Little Mai, Moomin Papa, Moomin Mama, Ninny, and Two Tiki. We also included Snufkin, Sniff, and the Hattie Fatteners. And so, but you may have to go exploring through the Moomin Valley to find them.
That's awesome. I love that. Especially the Hattie Fatteners, which we'll be going back to later. That's so cute. As a writer, how did you approach the world of the Moomin, and was it hard to adapt the philosophy of Tove Jansson's work to a game form?
So I really tried to approach the world of Moomin with reverence. I really tried to make sure that, as much as I could, that if Tove Jansson were still alive, that she would at least approve of how we have represented her work in Sky. Um, and it was only hard in the sense that it required thinking a little differently about the stories. The Moomin stories are very meandering, very dreamlike. They sometimes end in very uncertain ways. And, as a modern storyteller, I have fallen into the trap that I think many of us fall into, where I'm sometimes made very uncomfortable by meandering narratives or uncertain endings. So first I had to become kind of accustomed to that kind of storytelling. And the way that I did that was just by immersing myself in the books and like reading and rereading them. But once I got a sense for the feeling of Moomin Valley and the way that these stories typically flowed, the rest of it came easily. But that was the only thing, that was the only point that I think actually required, that I would describe as at all difficult, was just kind of getting used to Tove Jansson's voice and the way that she tells stories.
Yeah. What life advice do you think Snufkin would give to today's world of social media and constant connectivity? Because he's known as this philosophical mastermind who just appears and says something incredible.
Well, I cannot. I'm not going to try and be as wise as Snufkin is, because I think that would be a little bit presumptuous of me. But I do think he would say something to the effect of that it's okay to be alone, and it's okay for your thoughts to belong to just you. I think that there's something about the sort of need to share opinions and share everything that we're thinking all the time and share our stance on things that would rub Snufkin the wrong way. And so, yeah, I imagine that he would say something like, it's okay for your thoughts to be just yours.
That's a good one. That's a good one. It's just like from the mouth of Snufkin.
Thank you. I'll take that as a great compliment.
It is. Moomins are famous for their love of adventure. If you could go on an adventure with one Moomin character, who would it be and where would you go?
Oh, where would I go? That's a great question. So as for who I would go with, I think I would go with Moomin Troll. Like as much as an adventure maybe with like Little Mai or Sniff might make for a better story, I think that Moomin Troll would be the better companion, right? Like he would carry his weight, he would step up and be brave during crises or times of stress. And so he might be the boring answer, but I would choose him. And as far as where I would go, so when I was young, I was obsessed with stars and space and outer space. I wanted to be an astronaut. And when I was older, I very briefly studied astronomy in school. And so I think I would ask him to take me to the observatory up in the mountains to meet the scientists there. And I would also love to see how they reacted to the comet almost hitting Moomin Valley. I feel like they would have a lot to say about that. That would be very funny. So,
Truly. Back to the Hattifadners, which we briefly touched on. They are quite mysterious, and as I admitted, they are cute. If you could give them voices for a day, what do you imagine they'd sound like, and what would they talk about?
so this was again a fascinating question to consider, and I had kind of two different thoughts on it, and the one that I'm going to go with is this. So I think they would talk about the weather and nothing else. I think that they would all sound like little serious men. I think they would all have the same voice, right? And they would have like these very kind of like
Mhm.
deep, almost quiet voices that they would chatter to each other with. But I think all they would talk
Yeah.
about is what the weather is, what they think the weather is going to be, and what the weather was yesterday. I think I can imagine like a whole little crowd of Hattie Fatteners muttering to themselves about when they think the next thunderstorm will be, and like traveling to go and see where to try and catch it, to try and get to where it is. So that's what I think they would sound. Yeah, like a bunch of tiny little weathermen talking to each other.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. They are known for their love of weather and temperature, so that sounds about right, honestly.
Great, I'm glad I got that one. So